Welcome to the Thinkers and Doers podcast, where we hear from the leading thinkers and doers shaping the world around us. I'm your host, Luke Graham, and today I have the opportunity to speak with Dr. Adam Fraser, a peak performance researcher based out of Australia. I've known Adam for about a decade, and I've been following his work, including his two most recent books, Strive and Third Space. I wanted to delve into the themes of these books to dissect some of the trends and issues impacting us today in a post-COVID world, particularly issues around the gift of struggle, why struggle is often more rewarding to people than achieving particular goals, as well as how third spaces and the psychology of the commute impacts the way that we work. Dr. Adam Fraser, tell me, what is a peak performance researcher and what led you into this world?
I got to be honest with you. I think the term's kind of made up. I don't think there's actually. I think it's just something people call themselves because it sounds okay. But look, my background was my undergraduate was biomed, so it's really a blend of psychology and physiology. And after that, I did some work with elite athletes and went into elite performance, and then came back and did a PhD. They offered me a scholarship. It was too good to say no to. And my PhD really looked at how our lifestyle factors affect our level of happiness, our quality of life, all the way down to even really cellular stuff like how our cells work and how it affects our chance of getting disease. So that's my background, and peak performance researchers, really I look at how do we do things better? Like how do we adopt habits that help us be more successful in whatever we're trying to achieve, whether it's well-being, whether it's work-life balance, whether it's better performance as a leader.
And one of the things you say that you focus on in your work is this idea of disproving commonly held assumptions, and that's been a part of a number of the interviews that we've done so far on the Thinkers and Doers podcast. So, like, where did that personal characteristic come from? How do you go about that in your work?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think as an academic coming into the world of consulting and speaking, what I saw is you were either super entertaining, but your concepts were really thin, and in fact, most of the stuff was made up, or you were technically unbelievable, but you put people to sleep. So what I was looking at is how do you marry those two? Like, how do you be entertaining? How do you use principles of learning so that people walked away with really sticky messages? But after I did my PhD, I bloody needed therapy. It was such a terrible experience. And I kind of went, I'm never doing research ever again. And I started to speak. But what I realized is you sit there and you hear a motivational speaker say something and you're like, that's nowhere near true. Or they talked about a study and you go, yeah, but they looked into that study and realized it was made up, like it never actually happened. So what we wanted to do was just bring more rigor to the work we do. So one of our big differentiators is that we do our own research. We also partner with different universities and, some dispelled myths. God, what are some? One of the things we showed is that, we don't believe that people have a resilience problem. Like everyone's talking about, we need to be more resilient. We need to develop our resilience. We've been measuring resilience for 20 years. It's really high. And even if you look at educators that we're working with right now, man, they're tougher than nails. Half their arm could be hanging off they'd show up to work. And even you look at COVID, like we were unbelievable at responding to change and pressure and adapting. So when we're backed into a corner, we come out swinging. Like we're very good at that. And what we discovered is that people don't need more resilience. They need more recovery. So they don't have a resilience problem, they have a recovery problem. And they think to themselves, I have to be tougher, I've got to push myself harder, when in fact they actually need, how do I fill my cup back up, or how do I recover from that stressful thing I just did today? So that's one. we're currently studying financial advisors and the impact of like 15 years of regulatory change on them. And one of the things that everyone said is, oh, well, that's because the old people don't embrace technology and they won't innovate and change their businesses. And what we showed is age had no impact on adoption of technology or innovation. So it's just like a BS thing that everyone threw around, but there was no basis for it. We looked at women affecting that profession. It's been a male-dominated area for so long, and what we were trying to prove is, were women doing as good a job as men in that profession? Because the narrative was they weren't as good. What we showed is not only were they as good, but the only difference was women did 3 or 4 things better than the men did. So it's like it's giving basis to what's actually happening. And even we had a bank, they looked at their home loan lenders and they divided them into 4 categories of performance. And the narrative was that the poor performers were the new people who hadn't adopted the role and hadn't got their head around all the systems. What we showed is the poor performers were the people that had been there the longest, got stale, weren't challenging themselves. And so I think what we do is we research the issue because we have assumptions, and often those assumptions are wrong. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, it's funny that you bring up the financial planners example, because it was only a few days ago I was having a dinner with an old friend from back in Australia who has navigated that world over the last 20 or 30 years and managing the sort of continual uncertainty around it, and what you say about the technology and age. I remember actually a valuer in the US, a real estate valuer in the US, when I was doing some research up at Oxford on automated valuation models. She was actually saying to me that oftentimes the older professionals can be, counter to popular opinion, more how would we say, or better adjusted to tech, because it was oftentimes them who needed it, because of the lack of availability of junior workers in their profession to do the kind of grunt work that the tech was now doing.
That's it. That's a perfect example of it. And even just to give you one more with the advisors, what we discovered with this group, we initially called them the unicorns. They were the people who were, business was growing, business was profitable, great well-being, awesome balance. They were just kind of crushing it on every single level. And what we thought, like our assumption, or actually assumption from other people too, was that, these unicorns, they're looking at all this change as a good thing. Like it's good that we're doing more education standards. It's good that there's more regulation, more reporting. And what we discovered is their view of all the change was exactly the same as the poor performance. Like they all went, there's too much change. There hasn't been enough consultation. It's knee-jerk. So they weren't sitting there going, this change is great. They were going, no, this change sucks and I hate it and I'm frustrated by it. But the difference was they didn't let that frustration overwhelm their behavior. So they didn't take that frustration and spend 4 hours on a forum online, complaining about things. They went, this really pisses me off, but how am I going to adapt to this? Or here's my goal, so how do I adjust things to make it? So the key thing was they didn't have a different story inside their head. It was their ability to action even when they were frustrated that was the difference.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I get on the flip side of that though, the ones who say did have the time or inclination to vent their frustrations, does that then result in something like reporting bias, right? Is there kind of like the squeaky wheel gets the grease type of, situation that emerges from that?
What do you mean in terms of get the grease? What's the grease?
As in like, if they're the ones who are sort of, say, dealing with it and, how would I frame this? dealing with it without making too much noise around it. And it was almost by happenstance that it was discovered that they were having the same or similar sorts of mental processes.
Yeah.
Are the ones having the same mental process but are making noise, are they the ones who are getting things catered to them better, like, by virtue of lobbying or submitting complaints or whatever it is?
Oh man, now this is going down an interesting path, and I can't give you any data on the advisors because we just didn't measure that. And to tell you the truth, most of our evidence showed that regulators didn't really listen, didn't really take that stuff on. So what we often found is that these people are venting and bringing up issues, and it didn't really result in anything. So they were spending so much time that they could have been spending with clients and working on their business, being frustrated by that. Like, one thing that did make an impact was our research. Regulators actually sat up and went, oh geez, like, we didn't realize how many people want to leave the profession, or how we didn't realize how much time it actually soaked up. So our data went super deep. Like, we even analyzed how many minutes they spent on each part of their business per day and pulled it apart. But so I think it's counter to, because their mindset is, if I don't make noise about this, nothing's going to change. But what we often found is that noise didn't result in change, and doing something really proactive like our research was the thing that started to get their attention. But the reason this is interesting, I was having conversations with two groups, teachers and nurses. And what they're saying is no one wants to come and do our job anymore. Like, teacher shortage in Australia right now is crisis level.
Same
And a number of years ago, I spoke at a conference on education, and they put me on the panel, like at the end of the conference. And I think it was kind of a pity. Oh, he's hanging around. We'll whack him on. And most of the panel was about like regulatory change and, reporting and all that. And I think someone asked me a question just to be polite. And they said, how do we get more people in the profession? And I just said, you got to shut up about the money. Because what's the average news story around teachers? Crap conditions, terrible pay, kids are awful. I'm like, I know you've got to, from a union perspective, voice your opinion for the government, but you're killing your own profession. And I don't have an answer to that one in terms of what's the solution. But yeah, the squeaky wheel often, what we were finding is they're almost cannibalizing and killing their own profession by being so vocal.
That's really so. I was studying during COVID, and there were a lot of sort of issues. Some of the big old universities were really struggling to adapt to that change, whereas more nimble, newer universities were accustomed to remote working and things like that. So I think for them it wasn't as big of a transition. But you make an interesting point around the squeaky wheel, because I certainly was a squeaky wheel at certain points where I felt that perhaps my money wasn't being put to best use. But it's interesting, that third perspective. Then it almost insinuates that the recipient of the say squeakiness in this ongoing metaphor almost takes it as a given that they have an adversarial relationship with these squeaky wheels, and therefore it's almost like yourself as a disinterested third party in this is kind of the sanity check for both parties.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we're definitely, well, I'm not saying here be passive. If you see an injustice, you got to speak up. And this is where I don't have an answer, because you got to complain about poor pay. But at the same time, the problem is, like, you're sending this message of, because teaching's incredibly rewarding and an amazing profession, but that's not what the average person or the aspiring student hears.
Yeah. And you know what? This is a really interesting point that I never thought about, because I know you naturally do, by virtue of everything you do, like you would say that a big part of your work is education, right?
Huge. It's the whole ball game, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something I've always been very passionate about. Like that's something I've structured my career around since the day you and I met, which we were talking about just off air a moment ago, which is my first
too
day.
many years ago.
Yeah, my first day as a civilian. So for those listening, my very first day as a civilian, I saw Adam speak at a work event, and yeah, so education's always been something I've been fascinated by, but a big part of the reason why I didn't become a teacher and I went into more research and academia was a big part of that was the messaging around pay and the messaging around conditions for sure. Now, I mean, if that is the reality on the ground, then, I'm glad that I was given the warning, but it certainly did dissuade me from it, no doubt.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. God, that's a tightrope to walk, isn't it? Yeah, I don't have any answers on that one.
Yeah, okay. That's an interesting point that I'll ponder further beyond this conversation. You made me think of this for the first time probably in 10 years. But another topic we wanted to touch on today were a couple of your recent books, and the reason I reached out to you to have this episode was because there are a couple of themes in this book. Which you wrote, so 2019 and before, you might say. So based on themes pre-COVID, we almost have this, common era, before common era sort of situation. We now have this pre and post-COVID world, and so you're these are the Old Testament, you might say, these two books. But what I want to do is pick up on some of those themes and zoom into what's happened since then. Yeah. The first one, because it's more recent, is Strive, right? So Strive, unless I've done horrible research beforehand, is still your most recent book, right?
Yes, you are very right.
And a gift, you might say, with a subtle nod to the Stoics. What is it around this book, this theme of yours on why we feel more alive when working towards a goal rather than once it's been achieved? And this has happened to me a few times lately, so this kind of sticks for me a bit.
So the point of Strive was something kept coming up in our research, which was the importance of struggle and challenge. Now, and this was happening in a world of positive psychology, the happiness movement, which is all like happiness is well, I mean, if you look at the happiness movement, there's one message, which is positive emotion is good and good for you, negative emotion bad and bad for you. Like that's the message. But what kept coming up was the importance of, to be crass, like getting your ass kicked and having struggle and having really challenging things. And so we decided to do this experiment, and we interviewed people and said, all right, if you look at the goal setting process, if you can break it down into three big parts, like you set the goal, you strive towards the goal, and then you achieve the goal. And we said to people, like, what's the most fulfilling part of this process? And everyone looked at us like we're an idiot, and they went, well, of course it's the achieve. Like the only reason I set the goal is to achieve the goal. Like I'm after the result. But what we discovered, which you just alluded to then, was a thing called the completion myth. And that is where we dramatically overestimate how good we're going to feel once we achieve something. And so what happens is once we achieve a goal, we have a period of elation, but then it's very quickly followed by a period of flatness where we just kind of feel lost. Now, this was universal. This was, and I'm talking gold medalists that came back from the Olympic Games, and we interviewed them, and they said, "Man, I just thought it would make more of a difference to my life, or I thought I'd feel better." And they came back and went, "Oh, I had a real flat period." And even I had this conversation with Tony Hsieh, who founded Zappos, who's no longer with us, which is a huge shame. But what he was saying is when he sold his first company, I think he sold it to Microsoft for like 200 mil. I said, man, when you got the check, actually, he was saying, my accountant called me and said the money's in your account. And I said, how'd you feel? He said, I just felt really empty, because what I loved was building the business.
Right.
And he said, I already had enough money. Like, I didn't need more. And so anyway, this thing was universal. And we then did an experiment where we got people to actually go through that process real time. So they had to set a goal, they had to work towards it, they had to achieve it. And the thing about humans is we suck at recalling how we felt in the past, and we're terrible at predicting how we're going to feel into the future. So we got them to do it real time, and they had to do diary study entries where they went, oh, okay, I'm working on this, here's how I feel, here's my level of fulfillment. And what we discovered is the most fulfilling part of a goal is the strive. Like, it's when we're doing the work, it's when we're working towards it. And weirdly, the moments that were most fulfilling had the highest level of challenge and struggle attached to them. And the reason for this is that those moments require us to be courageous and to evolve. And what we discovered is people need courage in evolution like they crave love and connection. So that's the whole piece about strive, is how has our relationship with challenge and struggle changed over the last 10 years, and how can it be more functional?
It's fascinating because you hear, like, you made a really interesting point at the beginning of this conversation, which was around like, and it was funny. I was only having a conversation with some colleagues recently around like this delicate balance between good research and your ability to communicate it, right? What you were saying before, and if you look at sort of the catchy, but what people might say has less essence to it is this. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey, sort of thing. Well, that's easy to say, when I'm going through this painful experience and all those sorts of things. But it's fascinating that you've then put a bit of substance behind it, with this research. So how then, if we're to really test the boundaries of this, and we go, okay, there are some really unpleasant, like, I think to myself, in my most recent studies, I set a goal for myself of a certain time that I wanted to achieve in the marathon, because it resulted in a certain sort of little jacket that I get to keep collecting dust in the spare room for the rest of my life, which I've got in there. I achieved the goal, as a spoiler. But I can think back to that time and I can think to myself, okay, Adam's point around this makes a lot of sense to me. Getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and doing those 20 or 30K runs every day, and working towards that goal was, a moment that I was feeling the best, that, I was most proud of my achievements, all those sorts of things. But what about like, is there a tipping point where that struggle is no longer fun, is no longer okay, is no longer courageous? Is there a tipping point? Maybe it's not so much working towards a goal as it is, continuous stress, something maybe like single parenthood, very rewarding, but a massive challenge that, would be helpful if others were around to help.
Yeah, look, I think, going back to your point, the struggle is never fun. Like, it really isn't. I mean, if it's struggle, and what we talk about in the book is different types of struggle, and what you can go from trauma, which, we're not advocating in any way, to, like, just really hard, devastating things that happen to us but aren't trauma, and then all the way through to growth-centric struggle, which is, what's an example that's not fun? I got a 13-year-old daughter, and far out, her and I are clashing over her phone. So she's not allowed on social media, but she has a phone that she uses to catch public transport. But, she just talks to her friends the whole time. And I'm like, you got to put your phone away. So we're having these arguments, right? It's a struggle. I'm not enjoying it. It's horrible. But what it requires from me is to evolve the way I communicate and to evolve our relationship to come up with a functional response to that. Now, what we're also not saying is you want to be constantly in struggle. Like, you want to pull yourself out to, and it goes back to that original piece of, do you have recovery? Like, I mean, God, in your world, you would meet some really driven, high net worth individuals who are flogging themselves, and they get to a point and they just burn out so hard. Like even we've been doing this research on burnout, and I was talking to a guy the other day, and he said he'd burn out so hard that he had a new child, and he said, I'm literally holding this kid and I can't feel joy. Like I'm just so done.
Wow.
And this is something we want to avoid. So we want to stretch ourselves. We want to be in struggle, but at the same time, we want to recover. We want to do things to renew. We want to remove that struggle, and have periods where we're not pushing ourselves that hard. So yeah, does that answer the kind of...
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. And I had a mentor actually share a story with me recently around that, was that, he was on that treadmill and he was just going and going and going for years. And he sort of checked in with me and he said, Luke, be careful, man. You're reminding me of me when I was, in my mid-30s and just going hell for leather for, 10, 15 years at that point. And, he goes, it doesn't turn out too nicely if you keep going, so it's an interesting point. But on the flip side of that, then, when it comes to struggle and when it comes to demographics, right, something that intrigues me, and I know you address in the book and that you've addressed in articles that have come from the book as well, is what struggle means to different people. So in different generational cohorts, you might say. So I had some great news yesterday, or that I was able to share yesterday, I should say. The wife and I have been concealing it. I don't know how, because I love to talk, hence this podcast. But Monday was our 12-week scan for our firstborn. So
welcome to the club.
To the club, yeah. Yes, and a few people have said, like, the key thing, talking about teachers, what you're saying about teachers before, the main thing people have said to me is goodbye sleep, right?
Yeah.
Which is helpful advice, but it's like, one thing I thought to myself around is, well, luckily I've been conditioned for this to be so bad, kind of like the way that Australians frame the weather in London,
Yeah.
Aussies frame the weather in London so poorly that when you actually come to London, you're like, it's not that bad. It's quite nice. You still get 40-degree days, and it doesn't actually rain as often as everyone makes out. So I'm kind of hoping I have my London moment with the baby. But I'll stay stoked for the time being. But one thing I said to my mother when I was talking to her yesterday is I said, luckily those 6 years I spent in the Navy, nothing will prepare you, as I imagine. You're a father of two from memory. Two?
Yeah,
father
two.
of two?
2 girls.
I'm sure nothing quite prepares you for parenthood, but something I found quite that I thought would be helpful for me is that my very first 6 years in adulthood, I was in the Navy. I never had autonomy over when I slept and when I didn't sleep. There was always somebody in charge. Your boss was in the bunk above you, and they could at any time roll out if they weren't up already and give you a nudge and say, get up, you've got an 18-hour shift to now do in the middle of a stinking hot ocean in the Middle East or something like that, right? And so I hope that that's preparing me well. And the reason I preface this conversation with that, or this theme with that, is that you've done a bit of work on the avoidance of struggle, what you've referred to previously, not just as helicopter parenting, but you've got another phrase that you've used in the past. I think from memory it was bulldozer or snowplow or some sort of...
Yeah, you're on the right track. It's
powerful...
a lawnmower parent.
Lawnmower, that's...
Yeah.
Yeah, so tell me about that, and how's that affecting us, and how's that removing us from the ability to struggle?
Man, we have to come back to your Navy thing for sure. But like one of the biggest things we found in Strive is because of the happiness movement, because of that we're wanting to experience positive emotions all the time. What happens is when we feel discomfort, we're now going, oh, well, that's bad. Like, and how do I get away from this? And particularly, every generation thinks they've had it harder than the generation that follows them. And, you got all the cliche jokes. And I look at kids today and I go, far out, I'd hate to be a teenager today. Like, the social media, the over-sexualization of children, throw that in, as well as, the body expectations. It's just, I think kids today have it harder than I certainly did, that's for sure. And but what they've been exposed to is a different type of parenting. So I was brought up in the 70s, like I was parented in the 70s and the 80s, my parents had two forms of therapy, which was snap out of it and I'll give you something to cry about. It was just kind of like, sort your crap out,
Yeah.
and then we went stack hat parent generation, where we started to go, oh, rather than let them ride their bikes without a helmet, we should put a helmet on. Or rather than, this rusty nail sticking out of a thing, we should probably do something about that. And then we went helicopter parenting, where we started to go, I want to protect my children emotionally. Now what we have is the lawnmower parent, or snowplow, that's probably a better one, is where we go, I have to smooth the path out for them. And I don't want them to experience struggle, because if they get upset or if they feel negative emotion, that's bad for them. So one of the things we hear from educators the most is this chronic overprotection of children. And I'm not, and going back before, like,
from the parents, is that right?
From the parents
are feeding that back.
And look, I mean, what we don't want, like, when people listen to this, they then go, oh, so I've got to be mean to my kids. No. And I think of, I played a lot of sport when I was a kid. I think the most damaging people were sporting coaches when I grew up. They say horrible things to you. They say mean stuff. It's not about that. It's about letting a child experience discomfort. And discomfort is, let me give you a classic example. My eldest daughter's a gymnast. She got this new coach come in, and anytime the girls mucked up, they had to do burpees and push-ups. So, and there was a girl who was mucking up in the group and wasn't doing what the coach said. So she said, "Oh my God." And I picked her up from training. She got in the car and she said, "Oh my God, Dad, we got this new coach and she made us do all this stuff and she's complaining." And I'm like, "Cool, yeah." And she goes, "Oh, it's just not fair." And I went, "Yeah, sometimes it ain't fair. Like, it's just not." And then when she got home, she complained to my wife, and my wife said, "Oh, should we call the coach?" And that doesn't sound. And I'm like, no, like, not at all. We're not going to save her from that. What's the worst thing? What's going to come out of that? She's good at push-ups. Like, that's it. But this is what we're talking about: is the discomfort. And a classic one. A mate of mine who is a school principal said, day one of school, kids got allocated to their classes. School finishes at 3:30. He said at 3:33, I had my first phone call from a parent saying, I want to change my kid. They're not in the class with their friend. I want them changed and put in a different class. So the reason they do that is that child's in a new class and they're forced to build other relationships, or they don't. And in that, they're going to have to work out, okay, I don't have a really great friend here, but how do I survive this? And this is what we're talking about, is this demonization of negative emotion, of struggle. We're not letting them deal with this stuff. And that's the huge fallout for this generation.
And do we see that then, like, if we go beyond? So, like, I think about, I'm no longer, like, a big change, I guess, from, 20s into 30s is that you're no longer the babies anymore. The Gen Zs are in the workplace now and things like that. And, as you pointed out before, everyone's got, views about this generation and that generation. I think Aristotle was famously quoted for saying something about, like, the children of this day are, insubordinate and reckless and X, Y, Z. All these sorts of things, but is, like, how is that then also playing out, like, in the workplace? Obviously a lot. There's a fascinating book that I'm sure has probably come past you. You may not have had the opportunity to read it. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind, which speaks. Oh my God,
Jonathan Haidt's. It's one of my favorite books. It's brilliant.
Yeah, great book.
Keep going. Sorry.
No, go on. So Haidt and Lukianoff make the point around how that was impacting the university, and now that cohort's gone through into the workplace. But I guess my point would be that it mustn't just apply to, say, Gen Z. So I was maybe the back end of the Stack Hat generation. You were Stack Hat Gen. I came in at the back end of that when the coddling stuff started coming. Fortunately, I hope at least I wouldn't be considered one of the coddling types, but how does this play out in the workplace today with grown adults who are Gen Z or who are millennials and, or types?
Look, I mean, these new generations don't have a monopoly on not handling discomfort. We all suck at it. Like we're every generation has their challenge, and so certain people or certain generations are better at dealing with certain things. But the challenge, you take a baby boomer, right? Their big challenge is, how do I be a leader who is vulnerable, who is actually interested in my people, and has realistic conversations around workload and what people can get through. Because their most leadership style for that generation is just shut up and do it because I asked you to do it. And it's just like, you have to have this finished. I don't care how you get there, but you're going to do it. So every generation has a struggle. So for that group, that struggle is, how do I start to be a more adaptive, different leader? And that brings up huge levels of discomfort for them. So what we talk about in Strive is the fact that all of us are starting to look at struggle and challenge as a bad thing, and we're wanting to be comfortable. And I didn't really talk about it much in the book, but our whole environment makes us just so much more comfortable. I woke up, it was 3 degrees in Sydney today, coldest day of the year or whatever. I get in my car, I got a bloody heated steering wheel. And I've had this car, I've had a heated steering wheel for 5 years. I've never turned it on. And I looked at the thing and went, oh, man, I'm turning that on. I never turned it on because I'm like, who the hell needs a bloody heated steering wheel? Oh my God, best thing ever. It's amazing. I can't believe I haven't used it. But the problem is that we're just so comfortable all the time. And even you can talk about exercise. People are, I don't like exercise. It's uncomfortable. That's the whole point. It stresses your body, and then your body does all these amazing adaptations. But so I'm not just picking on this generation. Their challenge is that they've been parented in such a way that really exacerbates this, but all of us have problems with struggle.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And, for me, that was cold water. Cold water is something I could never get my head through. And, I read books on how to deal with it, and I just couldn't do it. Cold water to me is what obstructed me from a few things. I did
join the wrong organization.
Yes, yeah, I know. Not only that, but I volunteered for what's called ship's diver, which is the people who go and check the propellers and
you guys are nuts.
No, not clearance divers. Clearance divers is the next level. So the reason I didn't go further and attempt clearance diving was, which is, I guess, what you would say is the Australian Navy's sort of, in some ways, sort of like an equivalent of a Navy SEAL. It's sort of also a work diver, but the reason I didn't go into that realm was because I just couldn't get my head around the cold water thing. I just couldn't do the cold water. But So tell me about the Navy thing, right? That's a tough gig. I got some mates in the armed forces and some in the Navy. I mean, that's 6 years. You talk about struggle. That's just hard. Talk about hardening you up. That must have been. What did you gain from that experience? How is your life better because you went through that? Yeah, well, it's infinitely better, I would say, as to preface it. I would say, my challenge at school was that I was kind of the typical example of a child who, it's almost a cliche that the teachers would say, so much potential, but, can't sit still in the classroom, right? Later in adult life, after I left the Navy, actually, not around about the time we met, I was diagnosed with adult ADHD. And so maybe that had some sort of, suggest some things around how I really struggled to sit still for 6 hours a day through my childhood. And so going to the Navy, obviously completely different environment, plenty of exercise, going through basic training, really took to basic training, really enjoyed the sort of, the discipline elements around it. And went really well, really well, specialized in engineering. And I think some of the things that really impacted me, number one, is that I hadn't left Australia before I joined the Navy.
Yep.
And so it really changed my outlook on the world. I had a very small world outlook when I was 18, and that changed a lot by the time I was 24. I deployed to the Middle East, and I remember I had one situation. It's called a SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea. So there were 60 refugees migrating or trying to migrate. They were human traffickers were taking them from Somalia across the Gulf of Aden, and their engine broke down, and we were taking them back to dry land. And being in that situation and realizing, if I was in their situation, I'd be not just doing the same thing. I probably would actually be one of the pirates, right? And so those sorts of experiences, I think, I would say more so the way I think. The 6 years there really influenced the way I think. One thing I really struggled with was doing what I was told when I felt that I saw a better way. And my dad foresaw that. My dad was like, you're a bit insubordinate. You like to speak up when you disagree with something. And he's like, that might not go down too well in the Navy. And some people didn't like it. Some people loved it, and I got promoted very quickly. But others, were always trying to, get me into trouble for that. And, fortunately that never happened. But, it was, they were that's the kind of the cliff notes of the Navy experience, I guess you would say.
I mean, it must be so formative. You would look on many experiences and go, that sucked, but man, that was important, wouldn't you say?
Oh, big time. Yeah, I owe so much to those 6 years. Yeah, so much. I use it every day.
Yeah, and I mean that's the message of Strive. Now that doesn't mean you have to go out and do something as extreme as joining the Navy and being off for 6 years and going to vastly different countries. But it's like, well, even in my job, am I stretching myself? Am I challenging myself? Like, how am I trying to grow and evolve? How am I being uncomfortable? Like, you talk about cold water. I hate cold water as well. But I swim in Sydney all year round. And, it doesn't get super cold. I think maybe the coldest we'll get is, 16 degrees in the water, which is chilly.
That's still tough.
Yeah, but outside it's 4 or 5 degrees because I swim in the morning. But, I want to do this thing, and I love swimming in the ocean, and my body doesn't respond well. It takes me 45 minutes to defrost. I get really bad pain in my feet. I think I've got some sort of problem. But how it relates to Strive is I kept going to this swim expecting it to be enjoyable. And I'm like, and I would kind of ease myself in. And I went, it's going to suck. And I just walk, I'll dive straight in the water, but I don't have this delusional expectation of, maybe today it's going to be all right. No, it's going to be awful and you're going to hate it. Yesterday. But when you get out, you're going to feel better.
Yeah.
And that's this whole piece of that the struggle helps us develop. And it's interesting you talk about the Middle East. I spoke at there was a Dalai Lama conference in Melbourne in Australia, and weirdly, a princess from Kuwait was in that audience, and she watched me present, and she contacted me going, hey, we're trying to make the country of Kuwait happier. We want you to come to Kuwait to help us, which sounds made up. But when we were looking at, why were happiness levels dropping and what was going on, one of the problems was that life was too comfortable, meaning the country of Kuwait is a very wealthy country, and they have a very generous government and a very generous royal family. And people were just given so much. And when they went through discomfort, they were often rescued because, I don't know how, you go into the Middle East. I went there thinking, God, what am I going to get? And what I got, the people were beautiful and smart and thoughtful and funny. I properly fell in love with them. But one of their challenges is there's not enough struggle for them.
Yeah, I guess it'd vary from country to country, though.
Oh,
right?
massively! I mean, I'm talking about the complete opposite of the people you were dealing with, who are we're running for our lives.
Yeah.
And obviously, you don't want to put people in that situation, and no one would sign up for it. But even out of that awfulness, there is some stuff that helps us evolve and grow.
Yeah. And it's a very interesting point. And again, like, sort of going back to that sort of, the helpful contextualization of personal circumstances as well, which I mentioned, which was, having that moment where you go, oh, if I was in that situation, that would be me, and you see a lot of psychologists talk about that, like, you look back at history and you see the way that people behave and you think that you would have been the exception. Nope, you would have been one of those people, that's the way I saw the Somali pirates. I was like, yeah, no doubt. Like, if I was in the situation that they were in, I have zero doubt in my mind that I would have been a Somali pirate. No doubt in my mind. Yeah.
But even you talking about how you're going to have a child soon, I remember, like, I hope you have a sleeper. Both of our kids did not sleep for 6 months. One had reflux, one had colic. So we were sleep deprived beyond belief. And I remember it was 3 a.m. and my daughter's just screaming, and she's been screaming all night, and I have to get on a 6 a.m. flight. So I've got to go present at a conference. I haven't slept, and I thought, okay, we've got a very secure backyard and a really soft flower bed. If I put her in the flower bed, maybe I don't have to hear her scream, but she'll be safe. And I literally went, I think, like, this was going through my head. Would that be all right? I think I can do that. And I called myself and went, what the hell are you doing? And in that moment, I just went, oh man, this is why people shake babies.
Right.
This is why you hear about people doing things you can't even imagine. I'm an educated person who has a good life. Imagine, like, I'm a drug affected guy in, some terrible place. You start to develop this empathy and understanding of people do the things they do. I mean, obviously we're getting off topic here from Strive because we're starting to get into, like, people that are in trauma or in dire circumstances. But it still comes back to that piece of, out of our struggles does come growth and development.
Yeah, no.
And I didn't put her in the garden, by the way.
You didn't? Okay. See, a good podcast host sort of checks that in. See, I just let that. Yeah. I just let that.
Get off here at family services and knocking on the door. Yeah.
Well, okay. So if we talk about the gift, like, we've been talking about the gift of struggle, right? And that segues us nicely to, like, the sort of final theme that I wanted to address with you, right? Which is that I wanted to understand a little bit how some things that you spoke about in this book, The Third Space, right? How they have changed over time. So I'm freeballing here. I think from memory, you first wrote this about a decade ago, more than a decade ago, right? So some fascinating things have happened since then, right? So The Third Space, do you want to give us like a quick 20-second sort of what it is before my question?
The Third Space is the research we were looking at around transitions. Like, how do you move from one thing to another? So if you picture a model, the first space is what you're doing now, second space, what you're about to do. So you're about to move from one thing to another. And the third space is that transitional gap in between. So whether we're going from one meeting to another, whether we're going from, I've just been chewed out by a client because something went wrong, and I've now got to go meet a prospective client. What we started to explore is, what do people do in those transitional gaps? And what we discovered is how incredibly important it was. And this is a concept we've applied to, special forces, police, ambulance, triple O responders, even that transition between emergency calls, which is like a 3-second gap. But how do they use that to reset themselves to ensure they're focused and capture all the right details? Yeah, so, and one of the most popular transitions is, how do I go from work to home? Because typically people take the workday home with them, and it has a really negative impact on their home environment. So the third space is about, how do we use all these different transitional gaps to show up a better version of ourselves?
Yes, and so for those listening who know the world of research that I'm in around the built world and technology's impact on it and those sorts of things, will probably maybe intuit my next question, which is around then remote work. That's why I wanted to dig in with you on
Yeah.
how that has transformed since this book first was published, because we have this very fierce debate in the real estate sector and beyond, where we have, say, a lot of global CEOs saying remote work is an abomination and all these sorts of things. I know I have, as I've discussed with previous guests, I rank very highly on extroversion, almost fall off the spectrum, right, on it. And so I know one challenge I have with too much remote work is that I'm not stimulated enough in my space here, in my environment, because it's too quiet, right?
Yeah.
I need a bit of noise. I need a bit of interpersonal stimulation. And so, how do you see then bringing third space into this concept of the psychology of commuting? Because some people see commuting as this horrible thing. I've got to acknowledge I have a fantastic commute. If I run to work, I run along all of London landmarks, like along the Thames River, through some of the most famous Houses of Parliament, Hyde Park, London Eye.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I get the tube instead, it's a nice quick zip on the tube. It's half hour, 45-minute trip. So I've got to acknowledge at the beginning that my commute is an easy commute, but I love it. But how does third space apply to the commute and what people are now saying about working from home and how that's not helping you psychologically distinguish or compartmentalize work and home?
Yeah, man. Okay, great question. When COVID lockdown started, I got more emails from people about this concept than I've ever got. And what they all said was, man, I thought this third space idea about what I did between work and home was important when I commuted. They said, now that I'm working from home, it's 10 times more important. Because what our data showed is when people worked from home, their work hours blew out, right? So they were working longer. I don't know if that's the case at the moment because we haven't done recent research. This is through 2021. And what they were saying is the problem is that I just stay in work mode and I'm just constantly working. People that lived on their own were the worst because they went, well, I'm not spending time with people, so I might as well just keep working. So one of the big problems was people did not have any way to shift gears at the end of the day. Because the thing about a commute, even if it sucks, it's like a little punctuation mark that kind of goes, yeah, okay, you're moving into home mode, and yeah, you might do emails, and yeah, you might do some work, but it's still a punctuation mark. And when we're working from home, we don't have that. And what we've shown is 65% of people said, I'm thinking about work more in my personal time now that I'm working from home than I ever have. They also, like you said, well, the introverts are loving it, but the majority of people are going, yeah, I miss being around people in the buzz of the office. What we also, God, what's some other, the working mothers went, oh man, that commute was the only time I got to myself. Like, that's when I read a book, I called a friend, I listened to a podcast. Like, that was the only time people weren't at me. And now that's been taken away. God, there was something else I wanted to say about this. Oh, look, the other thing too is we measured connection to team and organization. And what we showed is the longer someone works at home, the more connection to team and organization disappears. Like, just even in 6 months in Australia, we saw a 48% drop in how connected to my team I feel, even though they said I'm nailing communication. Like, it was, in terms of rating how good communication is with my team, it was over 90%. We're still catching up, but there's just nothing like being in the room with another human being. So there's some of the findings we have. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I've even seen situations where, say, mid-tier, say, managers have been working remotely, and when they've come up for a promotion, their juniors have actually kind of come out and been opposed to it on the grounds of them being perceived as less committed to the team by virtue of never being around. Obviously, it's hotly contested on both sides, but it is a very interesting finding. And of course, that point around the psychology of the commute. And yes, mothers.
And where I think some of these CEOs are out of line is they've come out too hard. And I think the perfect thing is a blend of both. Like, I can choose. I think you never want to mandate something, but I think at least a couple of days in the office. I think, as you said, change the scenery. I'm getting out. I'm connecting with people. I mean, collaboration and working on projects is so much easier when you're in the room than when you're virtual. But also, I want the option to go, man, I've got to crush this report right now, or I've got to achieve something. I'm going to stay at home and just get this thing done. Because, what we also know is the average person in an office is interrupted around 70 times a day. That's a terrible environment to try and work in. So what we want is both.
I tallied mine in an hour once. I'll forward that to you. It could be a little piece of research for you. I tallied my interruptions once in an hour.
Yeah. What were they?
I think it was 6.
Yeah. I'm surprised. I'm surprised that it was that low.
Well, just 1 hour. That was just 1 hour. So
But even in 1 hour,
Yeah. Well, there were only 2 people in the office that day.
Yeah. And what's interesting in our research is ourselves are one of the biggest interruptions. Because we're working on something and then we go, I'll just have a look at Instagram, or I'll check this, or I'll go talk to that person. So that's my view on it. And what we've got to do, if we work from home, we've got to come up with our own third space. So we've had some people talk about, like I had one guy email me, he got in his car in the morning and he said, I drive to a coffee shop and I get a coffee and I drive back home and I walk in the door and I go, now I'm at work. And at the end of the day, he said, I don't need more caffeine, but I drive to a local park, I put on a podcast, I do a 30-minute walk around the park, I come home, and now I'm dad, I'm partner. So what it is coming up with, what am I going to do to change gears at the end of the day? Because what we know is when we successfully transition, our interaction, if we live with other people, is so much better. We ruminate and worry about work far less. When we socialize, we're more present. Like, the amount of benefits is just huge.
Yeah, our dog has been a big gift to us on that. So my wife pretty much works from home almost entirely, other than events that she manages overseas. But we take him for a walk just before we start our working day. We live right next to one of the biggest parks in London, luckily. And then he concludes our day as well. It reminds me, what you're saying reminds me a little bit of those memes that used to come up on social during the early days of COVID. I'm not sure if you saw them, but it was like a New Yorker would get into the shower and close the shower door and pretend that they were riding on the New York subway, and then like kind of get back out of the shower and step out and go into their office.
There were so many brilliant ones. But your dog walk is perfect. Because you're outside, you're in a park, which is a benefit. You're talking to your wife, so you got some one-on-one time. The other thing too is also low light, and when I say low light, I mean sun that's at a low polar angle. So that sun at the start and the end of the day is a different color because of the angle of the Earth, right? But that sun, getting sun at each of those points, helps us with quality of sleep, circadian rhythm, checking. It's just a brilliant thing to do. So keep doing what you're doing, because that's the perfect transition into and out of your day.
Yeah, right. Nice. Cool. Well, that's got to be a pretty good way to conclude, Adam.
Yeah, it's been. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I do say this now and then, but I know you're a very busy man. Your May 2023 was manic. I watched it on LinkedIn, but if if we do manage to secure another 1 hour slot, I think we'll have to do it at some time in the future. It'd be great to dive into some of those points in a bit more depth and hear about some more of your recent research.
Yeah, no, anytime. Give us a call.
All right. Cheers, Adam.
Thanks very much, Luke.